I'm going to ask our distinguished guests to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Dr. Bo Ansis.
Thank you for joining in. I am a professor of neurology here at Washington University in St. Louis and see a lot of patients, specifically adults with Down syndrome, and also are doing research studies. And I'm joined by Brittany Nelson. Brittany, why don't you introduce yourself for a second?
Hi, I'm Brittany Nelson. I work with Dr. Ansis. I am the senior research coordinator in the Ansis lab, and so I'm running all of our research studies with folks with Down syndrome. And I also see patients with Dr. Ansis in clinic as well.
Fantastic. And the second part of our presentation tonight will be a little bit more practical, hands-on information from our own Marianne Tolliver.
I'm Marianne Tolliver. I've worked at the ARC now for 40 plus years. And I have supported many individuals with dementia, mostly Alzheimer's here at work and people with Down syndrome. And in my personal life, my dad had vascular dementia. So a little bit different in both of those. But I look forward to, and I received a lot of my training through the NTG and as well as through the Alzheimer's Association.
All right, you guys take it away.
Well, thank you again, Sharon, and it's really a pleasure to be presenting to the St. Louis ARC and to the community here, as well as worldwide for this. Tonight, we're going to have a tag team between Brittany and myself. I'm talking about Down syndrome and dementia, the latest research, and then the second half, as you heard from Marianne, is going to be the support strategies, and we can also intertwine those two together and many of the questions and answers. So first, let's just put this into context of our understanding of the population and specifically what is changing in the population for those with Down syndrome. And you can see on this kind of graph that is here is that on the x-axis is years, and then you can see the population or percentages of the population on the y-axis. And so number one is that what you start to see is that there is now an increase in the life expectancy of individuals who are living with Down syndrome, which is really amazing because many of the previous complications, such as heart issues or lung issues, have now been corrected. And you can see a larger proportion of individuals that are getting to be older ages with Down syndrome. But we are actually hitting a kind of ceiling in these individuals. And what I mean by that is that the average life expectancy in the 1950s for an individual with Down syndrome was only 26 years. Now the average life expectancy is about 58 years, but we're kind of hitting that ceiling and we can't go any further in having even longer ages. And the major reason why is because of Alzheimer's disease. And why that's so important is that about 95% of individuals have a lifetime risk of dementia. That means that not everybody will develop dementia, but most will. And almost all of them will have the hallmarks, at least of Alzheimer's pathology. That doesn't mean that they will all develop again this dementia, but that does mean that they will have a lot of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. And so now we're facing this new conundrum. And why that's so important, and I think Marianne may be talking about some of this, is that it's changed and flipped the perspective. So it used to be that the parents would outlive their kids who had Down syndrome. Now the kids are outliving their parents. And so now the real question is, who's going to be taking care of these individuals? What kinds of opportunities and facilities do we have for so many of these individuals? And you can see that again in this kind of life expectancy, which I'm showing you here, and which I already just covered, of 26 years versus 58 years. And we're also seeing, and Chris Nikic is just one of those many examples of we're seeing, is that many of our individuals are doing so many wonderful accomplishments and doing so many cool things. We do bowling, we do all kinds of different games with them. And in fact, they're actually beating me at many of these events and doing much better than I can ever do. And we really want to appreciate their quality of life and really want to make sure that all individuals, irrespective of who they are, have these opportunities to have as full a life as possible. So what is really happening with Alzheimer's disease? So we talk about Alzheimer's disease, and we need to really think about it in a context of an umbrella. And what I mean by that is that there is this word that is thrown out there a lot, and it's called the D word. It's the dementia word. And if you really were to expect in the general population, what is the most common form or common cause of dementia, if you guessed Alzheimer's disease, you would be right about 2/3 of the time. But as Marianne also brought out, and what we're also seeing in the Alzheimer's Association and others, is that most people don't read the textbook exactly, meaning that they may have some Alzheimer's disease, but they may also have vascular changes. They may also have these other diseases, even something called frontotemporal dementia or other different forms. What is so different, though, is that specifically in Down syndrome, those individuals will almost all develop Alzheimer's disease. Now, they may also have some vascular changes, and we'll talk about that. And if people have more questions about this, we can talk about that. Something called cerebral amyloid angiopathy, but they will have these classic hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. And it's really these two characteristic features that are seen in these individuals. And that is on that far right bottom part of that figure is if we look at the brains of individuals, they see these big clumps of stuff, and those clumps are called amyloid plaques, which we're all making, but we're usually clearing. But in Alzheimer's disease, it's depositing in the brain. And the second thing are these tau tangles. So it's these kinds of changes within the brain cells, also called the neurons, that's occurring. And because of that, there is then a shrinkage of the brain. And you can see on the right compared to the left, the brain has shrunk, and it shrinks in some specific areas. One of those areas is this deep area called the hippocampus, which we'll talk about later, that's involved in short-term memory. When we look at that, as you can see, those are the two kinds of hallmarks of it. We really discovered the disease by a doctor who was a pathologist, Dr. Alois Alzheimer. And he actually looked at a woman who was pretty young, who had some of these plaques and tangles, so those two hallmarks of the disease, and then it was named after him for his discovery of this. What's so interesting is the woman that's presented here, Auguste Deter, she actually had a genetic form of Alzheimer's disease. So there was a family history of it, and she had it at a very young age, and she actually had something called autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease, the other main genetic form of Alzheimer's disease. So if we go to the next slide. So why do we see this specifically in Down syndrome? So we need to understand and go back to that biology. And I'm not going to give you fancy, complicated things. We're going to really simplify this to make sure we all understand this. So everybody, when we are born, we usually have these things called chromosomes. And we have 2 copies of these chromosomes. And on these chromosomes are these genes. And these genes make different proteins. What makes people with Down syndrome so special is they have actually 3 copies instead of 2 copies, and it's of chromosome 21. And on that chromosome, as I said to you before, is a gene. And that gene is something called the amyloid precursor protein, or APP. And because they have 3 copies of this gene, they make more of this amyloid. And if they make more of this amyloid, then more of it's going to deposit in the brain, and it's going to lead to these kinds of changes that we see for Alzheimer's disease. Because as we talked about before, it's a combination of these amyloid changes and these tau changes that are affecting the brain. If we go to the next slide. So what happens is that when we make this amyloid precursor protein, this makes this protein that's this really long protein. And then we use these little things called secretases, but I call them scissors, and it cuts up this amyloid. And this amyloid is into these smaller parts that are called monomers, and then they form more bigger parts called oligomers. So they kind of clump together, and then they form this big ball, like a hairball almost, but it's a plaque, and that deposits in the brain, and that's this amyloid plaque. And that amyloid plaque is what we see when we do the pathology studies. So if we look at the brains when people have passed, but we now also have ways to even use something called positron emission tomography or PET imaging that can actually detect that amyloid in the brain through now new imaging techniques. And so because of this duplication, and in this case, the triplication of the gene, that really leads to these more amyloid deposits in the brain. So if we go to the next slide. So how do we measure that? So one of those things, and I'm showing you on the left-hand side, is this amyloid measure. So we can look at how much amyloid is deposited in the brains of individuals, and we can kind of track it over time. And you can see on the bottom part of that is age. And what we see is that as individuals get older, there is this rise or really big increase in amyloid. And what's so interesting in Down syndrome is that it's a rapid rise in this amyloid, and we actually know when it will usually occur. And we know that in reality, it's around age 40 when that amyloid passes this threshold of being significantly detectable in the brain. And you can see those lines that it's really starting to really go up in these individuals. And then there is a period of time, though, between when that amyloid deposits and when somebody has clinical symptoms, meaning they have cognitive changes, they're slowing, and there's other kinds of changes. And we think that time is around age 50 to 52 to 53 is when those cognitive changes. So there's this window of about 10 years, 8 to 10 years, when an individual may have some of this amyloid or these tau changes before then they develop Alzheimer's disease. And that's a much shorter window than what we typically see in late onset Alzheimer's disease, which is 15 to 20 years. So it's a much more sped up process that we see. And we can kind of look at this and create cascades or hypothesize curves of when changes are occurring in individuals. And we can kind of backdate it to an age, and we call that estimated years of onset. So when an individual more likely will develop the symptoms. And if we said that's around 52 is when they'll have cognitive or thinking problems, and we work backwards, when do we see these kinds of changes in the pathology? Meaning that there is stuff that's occurring underneath, that's now depositing in the brain, yet the individual looks pretty normal, but they're already on track to develop the clinical signs, and they already have enough to meet the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, meaning that they have the pathology that's present. And when we go back, it's actually 20 years before. So we think that there's some amyloid changes, then there's some of these tau changes, then there's the shrinkage of the brain, and then there are those cognitive changes. So that's what we've hypothesized. And our lab, and working with other groups in the United States as well as Europe, we've been now trying to figure out, is that really what's occurring? And what I can now show you is that, yeah, this kind of looks similar, but there are some little differences from what we thought was occurring. So when we look at the amyloid, when we take those pictures of amyloid in individuals, and we see, does it reach a threshold, meaning is it above this number, meaning that they would be amyloid positive, meaning they have a large amount of amyloid that's present, you can see on the left-hand side of the figure, whatever our thresholds are, by age 40, there is already an increase in this amyloid, meaning that they are above the threshold. And then you can see as individuals get older, there's a continued rise of this amyloid. And that's what you see on that right-hand side of the figure, is that amyloid is continuing to increase in the brains of adults with Down syndrome as they're getting older. And it's really at that age 40 that we really think that really a lot of these changes are occurring. Now, some individuals it may be a little bit younger, some individuals it may be a little bit older, but on average at age 40, 38 to 40 is when we're really thinking that those changes are starting to occur. But again, it's not just the amyloid changes that's important. It may take a number of years later for those cognitive, but we think that it's very important to look and see those kinds of changes because, as you'll hear from some of the therapies that we're going to be talking about, that's the time where we want to try to attack it, bring it down, and see if we can control it. So the earlier we treat, the better it could possibly be. When we look at this amyloid and this tau changes, when we kind of put them together, one of our group of our members of our team, Dr. Wish, looked at that, and it's pretty quick after each other, meaning that Once amyloid starts occurring, we then start to see these tau changes, meaning it's a really quick process that's going on in these individuals within 2 years. That's very different than the general Alzheimer's disease or this other genetic form of Alzheimer's disease, this autosomal dominant we talked about, which is 5 or 10 or 15 years. So what I tell people, and it's kind of scary, is that Down syndrome is like Alzheimer's disease on steroids. So it's a really rapid process. It is a really rapid increases in these kinds of pathology. And we really need to be aggressive in looking at that and then thinking about ways if can we drop some of these values or some of these amyloid or tau changes within the brain. And then we also think that there's a role of inflammation in these guys. And we think that this inflammation is occurring with regards to this amyloid and tau, meaning that once you get the amyloid, these inflammatory cells, I call them almost Pac-Man cells, try to eat it up, but they do a little good job, but then they get stuffed and then they say, I can't take that anymore. And there's more inflammation that goes on. And then there's these other changes like the tau and the shrinkage of the brain that occurs. So why and how can we do and talk about all of this? It's really because of something called the Alzheimer's Biomarker Consortium for Down Syndrome. And so we are a part of that here in St. Louis, and you can see on the map other places that are also a part of it. But then in a subset of those individuals, as well as some other places in the United States, as well as in Europe, there are also individuals that are getting ready for something called a trial ready cohort, meaning that we're getting individuals, we're kind of seeing and staging these individuals, and then we're thinking about, are there therapies that are out there? Now, this is really heady times. If you would ask me this question 5 years ago, we didn't even have this information. We weren't even thinking of clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome. We now are having that, and we're now able to offer some of these clinical trials for individuals. So the field has rapidly changed, and it's going to continue to rapidly change even more in the future. As I was saying to you before, there's a lot of different ways to get into this trial ready cohort, either through this Alzheimer's Biomarker Consortium for Down syndrome, direct recruitment, or even through registries. And what we're trying to do is think about different therapies for individuals and then see if they work or if they don't work. If they work, great, we move forward with that. If they don't work, we drop it quickly, move to the next drug, and try to see how things can be beneficial for individuals. That means, though, that some individuals are going to get a placebo, meaning getting a sugar pill. Some will get the drug. If they don't get the drug, then they can go back in and then they have a chance of getting the drug at the second time for a different study. But we will also know that some of those studies will work or may work, but some of those studies may fail. But we need to understand that, and then we need to move on and to make sure that if they do fail, what is the next therapy that we can think about for these kinds of individuals? So what are the therapies that are out there right now? There were 3. They're now down to 2 studies that are out there, but I'll walk you through all 3 of the studies and how they work and what they're doing. So I started off some of our part of the talk was that because of having 3 copies of chromosome 21, there's too much of this amyloid. So a lot of these therapies, and because I also told you that amyloid is one of the first changes we think is in the brain, we have been focusing on anti-amyloid therapies. So ways to kind of reduce the amyloid. So there are 2 different ways that you could think about getting rid of the amyloid, either decreasing the production, or if there is more that's produced, can we suck it out? Can we get rid of it? Can we break it down? And so one of the ways to kind of reduce the production of it is something called an antisense oligonucleotide. That's a fancy dancy word. All it does is that it prevents the protein from being made. And so if you give it to these individuals, we kind of prevent the protein from being made, and that reduces the amount of amyloid that's present. The other way is to give either a vaccine or to give some of the drugs that we actually are giving for late onset Alzheimer's disease, and some of those that you may have heard about, something called donanemab or lecanemab. They all end with that MAB, M-A-B, and if you see that on TV, that means monoclonal antibodies. So we give antibodies, these little Y-shaped things, we go bind to that amyloid and we kind of get rid of it from the brain, and we can also get rid of it from other areas of the body too, even including the blood vessels. And so those are the three therapies that are out there. Now, the antisense oligonucleotide, I'm sorry to say, we were the first site and the only site in the world that did that for an individual, but that study has stopped. And we are now only down to 2 studies that are available. One of them is through this vaccine. So we give you a vaccine and then it is injected, or you get the placebo. And then we see, does that kind of reduce the amount of amyloid that's present? And then a new study that's going to be coming out that is actually going to be giving an IV form of the drug that's called donanemab. And we're going to try to see if that sucks out the amyloid from the brain. But there are also risks with it, meaning that there could be changes in edema, meaning fluid within the brain, or actually even sometimes bleeds. So we need to be very careful and follow these individuals very carefully. So the first study that I was telling you about was this vaccination, which is an early phase 1-2, meaning it's in its early infancy. We're looking for participants that are 35 participants. They're at ages 35 to 50. It's with these intramuscular, so we do shots into the arms, and we wait and do that over a number of weeks. It's being done in multiple sites. I'm proud to say that WashU has a participant in this, and that we're also looking for more individuals. And we were the first site that I know of in the United States to do this. This study is going to be closing soon, but it is still out there and available for individuals. The second study was the study that I was telling you about, was called the HERO study with the antisense oligonucleotide, and that was to produce the production of this amyloid. We did enroll a participant. However, that study is stopped, and it is no longer enrolling at this time. And then the third study, you go to the next one, is the Aladdin one. Now that has not yet started, but that is a phase 4, meaning that, again, this is a drug that's already been approved for late onset Alzheimer's disease. And again, in this, they will get this drug or a placebo. The age ranges of 35 to 50. Again, that's when we think when the amyloid's starting to change. And we're looking for individuals for enrolling, but they need to be staged for all of these kinds of studies. So that means they need to have PET scans, they need to have some blood work, they need to do some thinking tests, and we're following those kinds of individuals. So why are we doing that for the last study for the donanemab? And that's because we think that that's that drug. You can see on the left-hand side, it slows down the progress of thinking problems, meaning that it doesn't cure, but at least definitely slows down things. And then it significantly drops the amount of amyloid. So it takes a lot of the amyloid out of the brain, but it can also take it sometimes out of the blood vessels. And because of that, we think that it could be beneficial, but we have to be very careful and watch those individuals. So that's where we're at for different clinical trials that are out there. But there are other studies that we're doing. And I think Brittany's now going to talk about these observational studies that are also available in following of individuals.
So Dr. Ansis was talking about the clinical trials that are looking at different medications. In order to do those studies, though, we've had to do all these other studies to follow individuals to kind of figure out when and how those changes in the brain are occurring. So these are kind of the observational studies that we've been that we've been doing. So we've got a couple different ones that I will go through that are currently active. So the ABCDS study that Dr. Ansis was talking about is the Alzheimer Biomarker Consortium for Down syndrome. So this is following adults age 25 and older to kind of we follow them across the lifespan to kind of identify those different biomarkers like the amyloid and tau and everything like that. So we're kind of following folks from 25 and older so we can see when those changes are occurring so that we know when it's best to start those medications in the trials. For this study, like I said, we're enrolling folks who are 25 and older. We also enroll sibling controls so we can kind of see if the changes in folks with Down syndrome differs from their siblings as they get older. In this study, we do a full cognitive battery of testing. So we look at we do different tests looking at memory, processing speed, fine motor skills, and stuff like that. We have the study partner, so either the parent or caregiver, answer questions about the individual with Down syndrome's daily behaviors. Are they working, their medical history, stuff like that. And then we do those brain imaging. So this is how we see those changes in the brain. We do an MRI so we can see like volumes of the brain. And then we do those PET scans so we can see the specific changes in the amyloid and tau. We also do a blood draw, and then there's a lumbar puncture that's optional because we can also see the amyloid in the blood and the lumbar puncture. And so this is giving us a lot of information that we can kind of compare to the PET scans. So eventually, maybe we can only just have to do a blood draw instead of putting someone through an entire PET scan. And then we follow individuals every 16 months and do all of these procedures every 16 months so we can track changes across time. And with all of our studies, all the participants are paid for their study procedures that are completed. And then this is the trial ready cohort that Dr. Ancis was talking about earlier. So this is kind of just creating a big registry of individuals who are participating in our studies. And we're collecting all the data from the ABCDS study, as well as TRACK-DS, and then kind of characterizing folks in preparation for these clinical trials. So we're kind of gathering all that information, what their amyloid looks like and all of that kind of stuff, and then saying like, hey, actually, this clinical trial might be a really good fit for this particular person. And then we can invite them to participate in that. So this is kind of just gathering everyone together and then putting them in buckets for different clinical trials that might be the best fit for them. And then locally here, so we have the ABCDS study, as Dr. Ancis mentioned, is being conducted at our site, but many sites across the US and in Europe. But we have what we call the Down syndrome umbrella study is our local study here. We wanted to initially create this study because there was a lot of folks that we see who were either too young or too impaired to be in the ABCDS study. And we still wanted to be able to follow these individuals because I think they're, important to kind of follow those folks as well. And so we created this study for folks who are 18 and older. And we have, we've got the 18-year-olds to 25 that aren't captured in ABCDS, but we also have much older individuals who wouldn't qualify for the ABCDS study. So we can really see like early on if changes are occurring, but then also very late stage, what kind of changes are occurring. And for this study, we do a very brief cognitive assessment. We do the study partner questionnaires, again, asking about like medical history and behaviors and stuff like that. We do a blood draw. We're doing stool samples because we can also see changes in the gut microbiome. And then we're doing activity monitors and sleep studies. I'm sure a lot of you are aware that folks with Down syndrome are at a higher increased risk for sleep apnea. So we're doing at-home sleep studies and helping people get treatment for that. And then there's the lumbar puncture as well for this study. All of the procedures in this umbrella study are optional. And so everyone can kind of pick and choose what they want to do. So we have folks who maybe are nonverbal and can't complete the cognitive testing, but will maybe do a blood draw or get the questions answered from their study partners and stuff like this. So I call this the kind of a la carte study, and you can kind of pick and choose whatever fits you and your family the best. And we follow folks every 1 to 2 years. And again, of course, they're paid for that. And then we have a very new study that's coming up, is basically what we're calling the mini umbrella study. So like I said, the main umbrella study that I was just talking about is for folks who are 18 and older. We want to start looking at children with Down syndrome to see if these elevated amyloid levels and inflammation markers are occurring in childhood. And so we are starting to look at folks who are 5 to 17 years old and doing very similar tests. We're doing some thinking tests, the study partner questionnaires, blood draws, stool samples, and stuff like that. So again, everything's optional, but we're kind of really excited about this. This is brand new. You're the first to hear about it. And so we'll be following these folks. We're also enrolling their siblings and parents, and we'll follow them every 1 to 2 years. And then why? So all of this research, we keep talking about all of this research, like why does it matter? So we're learning so much from these studies. And we can only learn this information by families like you participating in our studies. This is helping us understand how the brain changes over time and is giving us really good information about how folks with Down syndrome are aging. And so they're, giving us major progress. Like Dr. Ansis was saying, 5 years ago, we didn't think we would have clinical trials. And now we're having a bunch of clinical trials that are getting started. So this is all occurring because we have folks participating in these observational studies, and we're learning so much that now that's translating into treatment options, which is really incredible. So every visit, every sample, every test is giving us really important information. And we have we have a lot of folks in the study who are just thrilled to be a part of the study, and they'll say that they're scientists, and it really is true. They are really leading the charge in this research and helping develop these treatments, not only for folks with Down syndrome, but for more broadly for anyone who might have thinking problems or dementia in the future. So it's really important, and we are so grateful for all the families that have participated with us so far. So Dr. Ansis also sees folks in clinic. So he evaluates and treats patients for all kinds of concerns like memory loss and dementia, thinking and behavior changes, seizures, and other neurological conditions. He's seeing folks with Down syndrome kind of across the lifespan. And we are, um, there's not, I don't, as many of you know, there's not a lot of specialists out there who are seeing folks with Down syndrome. And so we've been kind of trying to work with these families and other physicians to create a more robust system to kind of treat these folks as they get older. And it's an uphill battle, but we will not stop fighting. So if anyone is interested in seeing Dr. Ansis in clinic, we are always welcome for anyone. So we see patients on Thursdays, and you don't need a special referral to see us. We can take care of that and get you in on the schedule if you're interested. And then this is our information. So if you have any questions about the research or anything that we're doing in clinic, you can reach out to me. And then you can also follow us on social media. And I think that is all I have today.
That was a fantastic presentation, so much information, and we have lots of questions. So, Marianne, before we move on to your section, I just want to talk really quickly through some of these questions. First of all, how can people reach out to sign up for the surveys? I saw you had some QR codes on the slide. Is that the best way for people to reach you? Do they just contact your office?
So yeah, there was a QR code for one of the clinical trials. But if we have all the information for all the studies, so if anyone wants to email me or call me, I'd be happy to share all the information with them.
Yeah, I would just echo what Brittany is saying. I think it's really up to us and up to the families to really, this is the next step. We need to be actively, this is the chance for people to really make a difference and be really actively involved in this. And we have some opportunities, and it's both either from the clinical side, we're glad to see you, as well as there are now opportunities on the research side. And so if you contact Brittany or you contact us, we'll get back to you. We'll definitely are glad to see people, and we can see people both here in St. Louis. I also have privileges in Illinois, so we do see that. And then if you come here, we will see you. And then we also have had participants come from outside states if they are interested in some of the studies for the observational. But you need to be kind of evaluated in the observational studies to see if you are then eligible for the clinical trials. We only want to give medications to those individuals that have certain of these changes. It would not be right to do that to those that don't need it.
The first question we had was actually really interesting. If you've got a family history of dementia, do you have any data that shows how that impacts the person with Down syndrome?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we actually had a study that was part of that. And there's a group that is considering that. It was called the MOM study, but it was for moms and dads. And they were being also evaluated if if their loved one had Down syndrome, they were also being evaluated. It was a real big hit because then everybody was getting the same things and they were all going through the same things. And Brittany can talk about that more. We're analyzing those results. There are mixed results. So there is one study that has said that the mother who has a child with Down syndrome is a little bit increased risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. There's a different study that says no. And so we're actually looking to see if that answer, we can come up with an answer to that. So it's a really good question. We don't have enough of that information yet. But there's also genetic risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, and they may be also interacting with some of the genetic, this amyloid precursor protein. And one of those is something called ApoE4. And so that gives you an increased risk. And we're now starting to see that that may also increase your risk a little bit of having earlier disease in Down syndrome as well.
Okay. I really appreciate how you're pointing out the importance of research, because we're already learning so much from the work you've been doing. And I think sometimes people think of research as this amorphous thing that's out there, and it's really changing the quality of people's lives potentially. If you can get a handle on some of the amyloid production and the consequences, it's going to make people's lives so much better for so much longer. So I appreciate that. Question about the amyloids. Somebody asked if there was a difference between males and females that you've detected.
It's a great question. And we actually looked at that, and the answer is no. So we don't see real big differences. If you look in the males and females in the general population, I always tell this to my wife, she's the stronger sex, and I agree that any day. There is a little bit longer life expectancy in the general population. In the DS population, it doesn't seem as of right now, but hold that thought, because we are doing some more analyses on some other stuff, and I may have a different answer for you in a couple of months.
Okay. Brittany, somebody asked about what exactly is expected of sibling or parent involvement in the studies, and sounded like that was a bit of a pick your own adventure.
So when we have siblings and parents in the umbrella studies, both the main umbrella and the mini umbrella, that is kind of, they can pick and choose whatever they'd want to do. Typically those visits take about 2 hours, an hour and a half or so, and they can do as much or as little as they want. The sibling controls in the ABCDS study do exactly what the folks with Down syndrome do. So they're doing, a cognitive battery, answering questions. They're doing the MRI, they're doing the PET scans and the blood draw and everything. So, and like as Dr. Ansis mentioned earlier, it's really, really fun and interesting for the family members to participate in these studies, because then they're getting the full idea of what the folks with Down syndrome are going through in the studies. And it becomes like a whole family affair, that everyone's like, oh yeah, like it gives them a better perspective of the thinking test. Because when we did the parent study, it was quite funny. The parents were so anxious about doing the thinking tests. And they were like, is this what my, son or daughter had to go through? And I was like, actually, theirs is tougher than what you just had to do, like, and so I think it was really helpful to, just have everyone kind of experience a little bit of what everyone's going through. But yeah, for the umbrella studies, it's choose your own adventure for sure.
That's fantastic. Yeah, nobody wants a cognitive test at any point.
Right.
I'm
The
gonna ask
anxiety
one-
instantly goes up.
One last question for y'all, and then I'm going to turn it over to Marianne. It's about that research consortium, the international groups that are working. What do you see as far as research for Down syndrome in the US versus some other countries? Do you feel like that we are doing things differently? We're doing things more? What do you think about that, Dr. Ansis?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So if we look at Europe, there are a couple places. It's organized a little differently, and we have some colleagues in Spain, and one of our close colleagues in Spain, in Barcelona, he has all of Spain literally who have Down syndrome come to his site in Barcelona. So it's a little bit different for healthcare and where people are coming. It's not as well centrally organized here in the United States. We have a lot of these different groups that are doing it. I will also tell you is that in Europe, they don't have access to the donanemab or the lecanemab, some of those drugs that are being now used in late onset Alzheimer's disease. They have not been approved in some of those countries. So there are differences in access to some of these kinds of medications or doing that. That's why they're trying to even think about doing these clinical trials, but they can't because they're not allowed to do that in their country normally.
Mm.
I would say that it's even much, much different in countries in South America, as well as even in Central America. There's a lot more work that needs to be done there. And then same thing in Asia. We have very little understanding, not as much. So really America, and specifically this ABCDS group, is really leading that charge. And we're so lucky to be a part of it and here in St. Louis and to offer these kinds of resources. But I would love to see more resources offered to more people, but we just don't have enough clinicians, as Brittany was mentioning before, who are experienced, who are willing to see and want to see adults with Down syndrome. And so we got to change that message. And it really has to start even in our medical schools, as well as in residencies, and how we're educating providers, because there are so many pediatricians that are taking care of adults with Down syndrome. And they've come to me and said, I'm not a geriatrician. And I would say back to them, I'm not a pediatrician, but we can all work together for this. And so we really need more people and more awareness. And so Sharon and Marianne, I'm so glad that all the work that you're doing here at St. Louis Arc and others that are really bringing this to the front.
Well, and you've been such a great partner, and you work so closely with our Down Syndrome Association as well, which is a very key partner for us too. So we're really pleased. I mean, St. Louis is blessed with a lot of great medical resources, and this is one of the best. And Dr. Ansys, it's a tribute to you that you're still talking to us with all the patients I have sent your way. So please take one
We're
more
okay.
person in.
We're okay. You know that. Brittany and I will say, we're glad to see. We'll just, we may have to wait a little bit, but I have made it a priority, and Brittany would attest to this, is that if somebody with Down syndrome needs to be seen at our place, we will make sure that they are seen and make sure they're seen in a timely manner. And it may not just be for dementia, it may be for regression syndrome or other changes that are occurring. And so we really want to be that resource because we're very connected to the community here, and we want to give back to the community here.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate both of you being here tonight. And now we're going to pivot because Marianne's going to talk about more how to support a person with Down syndrome if you realize that there are some issues with memory loss and potential Alzheimer's. So Marianne, I know you've got a set of slides as well. Thank you again, Dr. Ansys and Brittany.